The death of Dr. Kelly, an open case. On the 20th of March 2003, the British government, alongside the United States, embarked on the military invasion of Iraq. This war devastated and ravaged an entire nation and countless families who lost troops during the war. I'm Safura Noruzi, and you're watching Aperture. The war was based on allegations claiming Iraq to possess weapons of mass destruction, which could be made ready within 45 minutes. The authenticity of these charges were questioned not only some years after the war drum's silence, but even before the war even started. In this week's documentary, The Death of Dr. Kelly, an Open Case, we look back at the voices that yelled out false evidence and witness how these voices were muted.
On the 20th of March 2003, US and British forces invaded Iraq under the pretense of destroying weapons of mass destruction. In 2009, the Iraq Inquiry was created to examine Britain's role in Iraq. Seen by many commentators as a marshalled and well-orchestrated production, the inquiry, led by Chairman Sir John Chilcot, was met with mixed responses by the public.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Sir John Chilcot, and I'm the chairman of the Iraq Inquiry.
In the months leading up to the attack, British Prime Minister Tony Blair perpetuated a lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in a bid to manufacture consent for the war. The Blair government claimed that Iraq had weapons capable of striking Britain within 45 minutes. It emerged later that this claim about Iraq's capabilities had been denied by a prominent British weapons scientist, Dr. David Kelly, during meetings with reporters. A few weeks later, Dr. Kelly's body was found near his home in suspicious circumstances. In 1996, a plan for the invasion and occupation of Iraq was finalized in the White House by neocons Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, John Bolton, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. Richard Perle stated that the plan was to wage total war by using the US military to invade and occupy any country that opposed America's self-serving foreign policies. Perle even believed people would sing great songs about them for years. According to Bob Woodward's book, Plan of Attack, when the White House decided to accelerate their plans to invade Iraq, Blair was not consulted. Condoleezza Rice informed the British government, and it was not until the next day that Bush spoke to Blair personally and thanked him. In the months leading up to the attack, US Secretary of State Colin Powell presented misleading drawings to the United Nations about WMD in Iraq.
I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441.
Standing shoulder to shoulder with the Americans, British Prime Minister Tony Blair parroted the lie about WMD in a bid to manufacture consent for the war.
It is the case that if the only means of achieving the disarmament of Iraq of weapons of mass destruction is the removal of the regime, then the removal of the regime, of course, has to be our objective.
Iraq probably has no weapons of mass destruction in the commonly understood sense of the term, namely a credible device capable of being delivered against a strategic city target. It probably does still have biological toxins and battlefield chemical munitions, but it's had them since the 1980s, when US companies sold Saddam anthrax agents and the then British government approved chemical and munitions factories. Why is it now so urgent that we should take military action to disarm a military capacity that has been there for 20 years and which we helped to create? Why is it necessary to resort to war this week, while Saddam's ambition to complete his weapons program is blocked by the presence of UN inspectors? Only a couple of weeks ago, Hans Blix told the Security Council that the key remaining disarmament tasks could be completed within months.
What was really important about this business of sites given was that when we reported that no, we didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, they should have realized, I think, both in London and in Washington, that their sources were poor. Both Condoleezza Rice and Prime Minister Blair, I sort of alerted to the fact that we were skeptical, and I made the remark then that I cited many times that, look, wouldn't it be paradoxical for you to invade Iraq with 250,000 men and find very little?
Well, I think what is interesting when you look back in my lifetime is when Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister of Britain in the 60s, is that the Labour government of the day did not go into Vietnam. Under enormous pressure from Lyndon Johnson, they said no. Tony Blair, for some reasons that most of us don't understand, was persuaded to go into Iraq, or I don't even think he was persuaded. He was side by side with the most right-wing, somewhat eccentric president in history in the United States. So it's still a question. I mean, the question that still isn't answered is why did he do it? Now, Tony Blair says, because I believed it was right. Well, I'm afraid that's not enough. That's not good enough.
Why do you think the Prime Minister was ignoring the warnings you were giving and going ahead?
I think this gets to the root of why we went. And I think now you can see the leaked documents. The Americans were determined to go. Blair had said he'd go with them. He couldn't get Britain there without going through the UN. But in the end, if the Americans were going, he was determined to go with them. And I repeat, I've said it before, but it's very important. There was no need to go at that time. There was no emergency. There was nothing happening that meant we couldn't have more time.
It's often said that Mr. Blair made Britain the tail of the American dog. But I don't really myself buy that. I actually believe that the British were co-conspirators. They were co-murderers of hundreds of thousands, maybe more than 1 million people in Iraq, which is a crime of almost unimaginable proportions and knocks the crimes of Mr. Charles Taylor or Mr. Ratko Mladic into a cocked hat, actually. I believe that Mr. Blair was intellectually superior to Mr. Bush, that he led Mr. Bush rather than was led. The British were not deceived by the Americans. The British and the Americans, in concert, hatched a conspiracy to deceive the world.
The idea that we doctored such intelligence is completely and totally false. Every single piece of intelligence that we presented was cleared very properly by the Joint Intelligence Committee.
Now, 8 years on, of course, we now know that, of course, they sexed up the case for war, which is what the allegation was. Of course they did it. And I don't think I meet anybody who doesn't think they sexed up the case for war.
But the point, just to keep focused on at the moment, is that the actual quality of the intelligence.
I did believe it. I mean, that was and I did believe it, frankly, beyond doubt. And
beyond your doubt, but beyond anybody's doubt?
Our partners in Washington are less interested in disarmament than they are in regime change in Iraq. And that explains why any evidence that inspections may be showing progress is greeted in Washington not with satisfaction, but with consternation, because it reduces the case for war.
Did you feel that it gave Iraq a realistic possibility of meeting the requirements of the resolution?
Yes, except that it was very hard for them to declare any weapons when they didn't have any.
Hans Blix had voiced concerns about the US regime's desire for war against Iraq. He was on record as saying that Bush and Blair were exaggerating the issue in order to invade, a position he maintained in the lead-up to the war. Blix has also said that the Blair government would have liked to have gone down the diplomatic route to disarm Saddam Hussein, but became a prisoner of a US policy heading towards war. Blix faced a barrage of intense criticism from Washington and the neocons for speaking out. It was later revealed that Tony Blair had already secretly committed Britain to war in 2002, promising George W. Bush that UK forces would join the US-led invasion, come what may.
Concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
This false claim about Iraq's alleged WMD was one of many contained in what came to be known as the Dodgy Dossier, a fraudulent document endorsed by Downing Street Press Secretary Alistair Campbell.
Did he tell President Bush in writing during 2002 that he would support the president if he took military action?
I think that I would certainly say the tenor of the Prime Minister wrote quite a lot of notes to the President, and I would say that the tenor of them was that, as I said earlier, we share the analysis, we share the concern, we are absolutely with you in making sure that Saddam Hussein is faced up to his obligations and that Iraq is disarmed. If that can't be done diplomatically and it has to be done militarily, Britain will be there. That would definitely be the tenor of his communications.
This is about the special relationship. Was Blair willing to say to the Americans, I'm not going with you now. It's too early. Blix should have more time. The international system means more time to prepare. I promised you I'd be with you, but this is the wrong time. We can take another 6 months. And I think he was so frantic to be with America that all that was thrown away. And if he'd done that, his place in history, the UK's role in the world, would have been so much more honourable. And this is Britain needs to think about this, the special relationship. What do we mean by it? Do we mean that we have an independent relationship and we say what we think, or do we mean we just abjectly go wherever America goes because we think that puts us in the big league? And I think that was it, and it's a tragedy. That is the tragedy.
On the 29th of May 2003, a story broke, questioning the Blair government's arguments for war. This would go on to send shockwaves through the British establishment. Andrew Gilligan, a BBC reporter back in Britain from Iraq, reported live at 6:07 a.m. on BBC Radio 4's Today programme that a news source had told him that a dossier about the military capabilities of Iraq was made sexier in the week before its publication in order to support the argument for going to war with the country.
The central claim in his dossier, which he published in September, the main case, if you like, against Iraq, and the main statement of the British government's belief of what it thought Iraq was up to. And what we've been told by one of the senior officials in charge of drawing up that dossier was that actually the government probably knew that 45-minute figure was wrong even before it decided to put it in. What this person says is that a week before the publication date of the dossier, it was actually rather a bland production. It didn't. The draft prepared for Mr. Blair by the intelligence agencies actually didn't say very much more than was public knowledge already. And Downing Street, our source says, ordered a week before publication, ordered it to be sexed up, to be made more exciting.
The source of this story was the UN and British Ministry of Defence Weapons Inspector, Dr. David Kelly. Eventually, it was confirmed that Dr. David Kelly had been the source for BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan's story.
He was he'd come forward to the Ministry of Defence, as he thought, in confidence. He'd been promised that his name wouldn't be revealed as the source. They'd then broken that promise. They'd outed him. They'd quite deliberately leaked, or effectively leaked, his name to the press. They gave the press a series of clues which enabled anyone with an internet connection to guess his name. They then confirmed the name to any journalist who guessed it, and one newspaper, for instance, put more than 20 names to the Ministry of Defence press office before it confirmed David Kelly's. After the name emerged, they then pushed the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons to interview him, even though it had already finished its inquiry and didn't actually want to interview him.
What happened after the war, of course, was we ran a piece on the Today programme early one morning saying that a source from within the intelligence community had alleged that the government had fixed the case for war, that they hadn't properly scrutinised the intelligence and put it through the normal process. As a result, we ran the story. As a result, the government went ballistic. They then leaked out the name of the person they thought was our source, a Dr. David Kelly.
He was paraded on television in front of those MPs, subject to a very unpleasant experience for him. He was harangued by one of the MPs. It was called Chaff. And he was asked a number of questions about his interactions with journalists, to which he did not give totally frank answers, and I think that worried him. And the Ministry of Defence told him that they were going to investigate some of those answers.
Treating you uniquely as a civil servant in highly publicising you before going to the Intelligence and Security Committee.
That's a conclusion you can draw.
The feeling I have, and you might be able to help me on this, is that...
Certainly this 45-minute claim, which came up in a British government document 6 months before the Iraq War, and was repeated, I think, 3 times in the document, that Iraq could have its weapons of mass destruction ready within 45 minutes, which was given massive publicity in this country. He knew that wasn't true. Probably he knew a lot of other things were not true as well, but he certainly knew that wasn't true. So one day he carries on with this process of talking quietly to journalists, which he'd been encouraged to do for about 10 years, and suddenly what he says is not acceptable for once.
At that time it mattered acutely what he was saying, because he was the only person of authority, a professional person, who was evidently leaking the story that there were no, in his view, almost certainly no weapons of mass destruction. And this was before we'd invaded a neutral country, contrary to international law. So therefore they had every reason to be worried about what he was saying. It could have removed the pretext for war. It seemed to be doing so.
On July the 17th, 2003, Dr. David Kelly was found dead in suspicious circumstances on Harrowden Hill, near his home in Oxfordshire. With Dr. Kelly's sudden demise, the government no longer had to fear what he may or may not have known, or what he may or may not have revealed to the public about the war against Iraq.
I came across him as somebody with an expertise in a field I was covering, Iraqi biological and chemical weapons. I can't exactly remember at this distance when my first meeting was or how it came about, but we had a number of one-to-one meetings. He was a good source. He'd given information which had been reliable in the past. We met up in May 2003 to talk about Iraqi things. I'd not long come back from Iraq. He was interested in that. Obviously the war had only just finished, and we got to talking about the dossier, and he said it had been transformed to make it sexier. He said that one of the key pieces of intelligence that had underpinned the dossier was single source and wasn't regarded by him and other experts as reliable.
Individuals who are of a particular moral fibre or who are highly principled may take a view which differs from the view being expressed by government. And they may be conducible, but perhaps not if they're of such high integrity. And it may be that such people come under various pressures in order to be able to change their view. We see it as an everyday event, so far as members of Parliament are concerned, that may want to vote against a government whip. There are all kinds of pressures that each of us are placed under. And undoubtedly, David Kelly had many pressures, professional, public, personal, which he had to face.
In journalist Christopher King's Redress Information and Analysis report, published on May the 20th, 2010, he concluded that the Blair cabal found that it had put in the public spotlight a weapons inspector of unimpeachable competence and integrity, who had sufficient knowledge and authority to destroy their entire case for war at a time when public feeling against the war was high.
You cannot look at the Kelly case without looking at the 12 years that went before it. And really, the 12 years that went before it is itself an enormous crime. And out of it comes the Kelly case. And I think it's very striking, for example, in this country where we have a free press, as they put it, that they promoted the Iraq War on the basis of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and then there was some kind of scandal when there were no weapons of mass destruction, but they managed to keep completely quiet the deaths of many, many people under the 12 years before that. They've just buried that question. And really, the Kelly case is part of that big scandal.
His death, whether by his own hand, by suicide, or whether it was in fact homicide, murder, was all to do with the Iraq War. Kelly wouldn't have been dead if there wasn't an Iraq War. And the Iraq War was founded on a pack of lies. Blair and Bush and the rest of the cabal had snatched WMD and all the rest of it from thin air as a pretext for annihilating Iraq. I'm exaggerating a little, but that's what in effect has happened. Iraq has been finished by this, like Galloway said, like wolves, being set upon the country.
Dr. Halpin quotes me as talking about Britain and America falling on Iraq like wolves, but I later apologized to the wolves because no wolf would ever have committed such a savage and unnecessary act of mass destruction.
The legal ramifications for Tony Blair and his government were quite clear: conspiring with the US to deceive the British public and launch a war of aggression against Iraq would be a direct violation of the Nuremberg Accords and leave the Blair government open to prosecution as war criminals. The Hutton Inquiry, whose head, Lord Hutton, was appointed by the Blair regime, convened on August the 12th, 2003 to investigate the death of Dr. Kelly. The inquiry exonerated Tony Blair and ruled that Dr. Kelly's death was a suicide.
I am satisfied that Dr. Kelly took his own life in the wood at Harrowdown Hill at a time between 4:15 p.m. on the 17th of July and 1:15 a.m. on the 18th of July 2003, and that the principal cause of death was bleeding from incised wounds to the left wrist, which Dr. Kelly inflicted on himself with the knife found beside his body.
The Hutton Inquiry's findings were widely regarded by experts as a whitewash and a government cover-up. After all, Lord Hutton was appointed by the very government he was supposed to investigate, thus posing a conflict of interest.
There was an investigation done by someone called Lord Hutton, who was appointed by the government, and as one member of the government told me at the time, or told us at the time, we appointed the right judge, and they did. They appointed a judge who found for them.
The inquiry that took place with Lord Hutton wasn't an inquiry that investigated all the possible angles. It took place at a time when it's quite possible that there were people who ought to have come to give evidence were not called, and those people who did come and give evidence never gave evidence on oath. And I think it's a big failing that there hasn't been an inquiry like an inquest where a coroner could call particular people to attend and insist that they're there, and when they come, ask them to give evidence on oath.
So I felt uncomfortable about the level of the investigation into the circumstances of death, and I felt extremely uncomfortable as a doctor, and indeed I have never spoken to another doctor who has done anything other than agree with me that it's highly improbable that anyone would ever die from hemorrhage as a consequence of the severance of the smaller of the two arteries in the left wrist.
As the curtain came down on the Hutton inquiry, an epic sequel was already in the works, as crowds and players alike rolled up for the Iraq inquiry.
I think we need to take a break at this point. Can you save it up till after the break? Thank you.